Okay. So, hello everyone. You're all very welcome to today's Doctoral College webinar. This is called Secrets to Becoming a Successful Doctoral Researcher. So, what we're just going to outline in this brief session today is just about what it is that you could do. Hopefully, these are just suggestions or some guidance for you with regard to what you can do to becoming, a more if you like, productive or a more skilled, more accomplished doctoral researcher. So the first thing I'm going to say, we have 25 of these and there's, as I said, I'll go through them rather quickly because I think a lot of them will be self-evident and self-explanatory. Okay, so the first one that we have is, so I'm going to try and bring going to see if we can get this to work. So is pick a research topic that you're passionate about. So obviously many of you will have already picked a research topic, but it's so important that the topic you pick is one that you are passionate about, because there will be times throughout your doctoral journey, throughout your PhD, when you lose your passion for your subject, when you find that it becomes, overwhelming and tedious and almost like something that you resent. But that's when it's really important that you have something you're passionate about, because that passion, that original passion, will help you to get your enthusiasm back for the topic. So while we all go through what's called the PhD trough, or that time where we just begin to really lose our will to engage with the PhD, having a subject that you feel that you're ultimately passionate about is one that will help you to overcome that particular trough and to come out the other side. So it's, again, and plus you want to do something that you're really interested in. So, but I'm sure you've all done that already, but it's a really important thing to do. And that would be, the first advice to give to someone who's ever thinking of doing a doctorate or a PhD is just pick something that you're passionate about. Also, I think what's very is a non-negotiable, if you like, is to have a supervisor that you have a good relationship with, but also a supervisor with a good research record in your particular field. When you're doing a doctorate, PhD, you have to think that the supervisor is perhaps the person is the person with whom you have the most important relationship throughout that time. Apart from your family members and friends. But in terms of your working context, the supervisor and you that relationship will be absolutely fundamental to the success of your PhD. And there have been cases, where relationships break down between the supervisor and the PhD or doctoral candidate, and that relationship becomes very difficult to mend. But also it means that it's quite disastrous then, because we're in a situation where it's very difficult for the candidate or for the student to advance further in their studies. But apart from all of that, and we'll be talking about that in the managing your relationship with your supervisor webinar, what's also fundamental is that your supervisor has a good record in your research field, because it's critical that they do, because there's no point having a supervisor whose interests are tangential or somewhat, if you like, are alien to what you are doing. So it's somebody who should have a good research record in the field, not necessarily in the specific area or in which you are studying, but just in that general field. It's absolutely fundamental. I think it's also good to, become familiar with your supervisor's research, and their methodological expertise, because again, when it comes to things like, your methodology is going to be so important. So, if I were to think of, say, a methodology chapter, just off the top of my head, if I could think of, say, what a methodology chapter would be, it would have things like, you'd be stating the research problem and your objectives. Then you'd be looking at your research approach, which would be, quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods. Then your research design, which would be something like, case study, or it may be experimental. Then you'd be looking at things like sampling and what kind of sample size you'd be using, or what kind of samples would you be using, random sampling, purposive sampling, snowball sampling, things like that, so then you have to think of how many participants there are, what are your inclusion and exclusion criteria. Just also things like data collection, what tools and techniques are you using to gather your data? Are you using surveys, interviews, observations, experiments, etc.? All of those things you have to take into account in your methodological chapter. It's so important there that your supervisor has that kind of methodological expertise, because they'll be able to help you then with things like, say, data analysis or data collection. They'll be able to tell you in terms of, say, data, your data analysis is how you process and analyze your data. So whether it's whether using thematic analysis or statistical analysis, and just things like ethical considerations as well. So that's why it's really important, that you have, you're familiar with your supervisor's methodological expertise, and they should be able to guide you a lot in this instance, because your methodology is going to be a really, really crucial aspect of your PhD. I'd say also what would be really good to do is to develop, or try and develop as much as possible, a training and career development plan. So what you could do here is just to try and develop a plan in terms of your own future career. And we can work with you on this and with your supervisor on this, but it's really good to do so, because once you have a career goal, that can really help you focus, on your doctoral studies, and to see, what it is you need to do. If you're thinking of an academic career, you might be thinking then, say, in terms of publications, and what kind of publications, you should have in which kind of journals. And also it could just help you in terms of, say, getting teaching experience, or engaging in committees and various things around the university. So it's always good to think about, what kind of training do you need if you're thinking about a career within industry, thinking about the kind of skills that you will need for that, and just things that you might not necessarily be aware of, or aware of the importance of, like, say, project management skills, or communication skills, presentation skills. All of those you will improve by doing the PhD, but it's also good to be aware of them, because employers will want you to articulate what skills you have, apart from your own specific expertise in the PhD. I think also what's good is to have what we might call, realistic expectations of your supervisor. So for you, your doctorate is the most important thing in the world, probably at this stage. But for your supervisor, they're going to have a very different interpretation of that. Yes, your work, your research is really important to them, but it's perhaps not the most important thing in their working life. So you have to think about, things like, and what's really good to do is, before you start even, and even if you're on the second, third, fourth year of your PhD journey, it's always good to sit down with your supervisor and think, okay, for this academic year, how often are we going to meet? How often will I receive feedback? And to schedule meetings with your supervisor, but giving them as much notice as possible. So, because your supervisor won't necessarily have an open door policy where you're free to come and go, and discuss everything just on a whim. They'll need some notice usually to discuss things with you. But also it's good just if you say with your supervisor, okay, can we meet every month, or every 2 months, or every 6 weeks, whatever it may be, but what's really important with your supervisor as well is to ask, well, how often can I receive feedback? Because that can be a frustration for people doing a doctorate, is not getting feedback, for quite an amount of time, and that can lead to, tensions and aggravation in the supervisor and doctoral candidate relationship. Okay, this I have, or this is a piece of advice which I received. Unfortunately, I received this after I'd done my own PhD, and I thought, I heard this in a supervisor workshop, and I thought, oh, that's fantastic advice. That's something which oh, I wish I had been told that. And I remember that this supervisor in the workshop said the advice that he gives to his PhD candidates is to write to the research question. So once you have your research question, and again, the research question is something that's iterative. So it can take a long time to get your research question up and ready and honed and finely tuned and perfected. So it's always good to, when you are, in the process of finalizing or just doing your research question and having a good idea of what your research question is ultimately going to be, just think of the importance of that. Your research question, in fact, it's like your guiding light. It's like your North Star, your Polaris, if you like, because that is going to guide everything you do. When you're doing a doctorate, it's always possible that you could end up reading or trying to read everything about the topic that you're doing. And in fact, not being productive in terms of writing. When you have your research question, what that gives you is a framework in which to write so everything you write is based on trying to answer your research question. So this supervisor in that workshop I talked about, he said what he gets his PhD or doctoral students to do is to write out the research question, to place it where they are working in their, workspace or at home on the wall, wherever it may be. And he tells them that is what you're writing to, because if you don't know what you're writing to, or if you don't know your research question, you can end up, as I said, reading everything, or you could end up writing something which has no significance ultimately for your doctorate, for your PhD. So it's always good, to try and finalize your research question, as early as possible into your doctoral journey, and then to write to that particular question. It's so important because, as I said, we have so much information that we can draw on, but when you're doing a PhD, your research question is what you're trying to answer. So it's really, really important that you write to that. Okay. Again, it's always good to try and treat your doctorate as a job. So, and it's not that easy because, in a sense, you have great latitude and freedom in which to work, but it's always good to treat your doctorate, to treat your PhD as you would treat a job. So, to work on it, so if your working hours or whatever, typical working hours are from, 9 to 5, to try and stick to those and adhere to those hours when it comes to doing your doctorate. So I think it's really important to kind of structure your time, to set goals, and that will really help you in terms of just keeping advancing in your doctorate. Because, as I said, the temptation is always there to engage in any kind of displacement activity. But if you treat your PhD as a job, if you can dedicate certain time every day to doing your doctorate, you will find that the progress you make is quite astonishing. Okay. So become socialized to the research culture of your faculty or your department. So here, I would say what this means ultimately is to, be aware of what the research culture is within your own faculty, within your own school, within your own unit, within your own department. It's really important that you do so, that you're aware of what's happening with regard to the research, not just with your supervisor, but with other people within the faculty and department as well. That will help you, for example, if you're teaching students, undergraduate or master students within the faculty, but also it would just help you just become aware of the research culture that is there within that faculty and department. And your awareness of that will just ultimately help you, not just with your PhD, but with your future career as well. And also, it's really good, just number 9 here, is to build and maintain professional relationships, with faculty members, with your fellow postgraduate researchers and with recent graduates. So that's always good. And, you know, we're going to do a session later this semester about networking and social media for PhD researchers. And again, you'll get a lot of specific ideas with regard to that. But it's really good to build and maintain professional relationships, you know, with people in your area. Here in UL, we have some PhD networks. Like we have, you know, at the Bernal Institute, you have Yes Bernal, and also there is, for example, Emerge PhD network. And and there is one also in the Irish World Academy. There is one, I believe, in the Chemie Business School as well. But these networks really, really help you, because a lot of the time in your PhD, it's really comforting to know that there are others who have the same problems as you. Something that PhD candidates suffer from, obviously, is something called imposter syndrome, where you feel like you don't deserve to be here, or that you're not worthy of, you know, or that you'll be found out in, you know, as an insufficient scholar. But that's, you know, everybody, I think, so many people go through that. But that's why it's important to have a network of people that you connect with, because you can talk about problems like that, and you can talk about general problems, you know, and it's not just a case of talking about specific areas of your research, but you could talk about things like, say, you know, your methodology. You might say, you know, that you have, you know, a problem with your data collection or your data analysis or something like that. And it's always good to talk about with others about those kind of things, but also just about general problems, you know, like, say, managing your time, or just how difficult it is with all the pressure that you have, you know, at doing a PhD. So it's always really good to speak to others and to have a network and to connect with others for your own sanity, and also just for your own, you know, for your own well-being, and just for the benefit of your research and your progress on your PhD as well. Okay, it's always good to look for opportunities to write, to co-author with your supervisor and with your faculty colleagues. Now, again, very much depends on the research culture of various departments and the research culture of certain schools and units and departments within the university, but also, and it can depend also on the personal relationship that people have with their supervisors, with their single supervisors, or with their supervisory team. But when you're doing a PhD, there should be opportunities. You know, I know this isn't going to apply to everyone, but there should be opportunities to co-author with your supervisor. And again, it's always good to decide, you know, on what, on who gets the credit. This is you know, another discussion, but it's always good to decide who's going to be the first name on a paper. Say, for example, if you're in the School of Medicine, or if you're in, you know, the Faculty of Science and Engineering, where so many people are doing a PhD or doctorate that is, if you like, based on a number of articles that you're writing. So say, for example, it's an article-based PhD, and you're expected to have, 3 published articles by the time you complete your thesis. What you will have to decide in advance with the authors of those papers is whose name goes first. It's in terms of academic convention, this can be quite important, because usually the first name is the one who has made the greatest contribution to the paper. So sometimes the supervisor may ask that they be the lead author on the paper. But if you feel that you have done, you know, 90% of the work, then you would be perfectly justified in having your name as the first name on that particular paper. So again, this could be something to sort out, you know, with your supervisor, and with your faculty colleagues and with your other authors in advance, because it would be important, if you're doing an article-based PhD, that your name is prominent in at least one of those papers, you know, or that you're the lead author in at least one of those papers. So again, you know, it's really important that you try to, you know, co-author with your colleagues or with your supervisor, but just be aware, you know, of the importance of having your name down as first on at least one of those papers. Okay, so here, sometimes people ask, or I tell people at least, that the most important quality when you're doing a PhD is persistence. It's not, it's not genius. It's not, amazing intelligence. It's not, innate talent. The most important characteristic, I would say, is persistence, because it is amazing how often you will meet with setbacks and you'll deal with rejection and you'll deal with something going wrong in your PhD. And it's just having the persistence to keep going is what will distinguish you from, from others, because there is a temptation to give up. I sometimes look at, some of the most talented people, say, for example, you can look at, talented people in certain ways. If you look at talented people in sports, there are, talented people in sport, there are talented people who are immensely gifted, but will never have, if you like, the work ethic, which makes them, into incredible champions. But if you have someone who is talented, but also matches that talent with a kind of work ethic and an ability to be persistent when things are going wrong, that is just unmatchable. And that's what sets them apart as wonderful and great champions, is that kind of persistence, because you're always going to meet, as I said, always going to meet with setbacks. You'll probably have rejection, maybe for the first time in your, in terms of your educational attainment while you're doing a doctorate or a PhD. There will be times, when you're told by reviewers in a journal that your work is, that the paper is not up to the standard that they're looking for. There will be setbacks like that. You put in for a funding application and you're told, that that you've been unsuccessful. But it's really important, or you have experiments that go wrong, or the consent that you attained for, from participants for a certain number of interviews has been withdrawn. All of these things happen to PhD candidates as you go along on your doctoral journey. And that's why it's so important to have persistence and to keep going, because that is what will distinguish you, from other from other people in education. Okay, it's always really good to master the literature. As I said, when I was talking earlier about the about writing to the research question, it's also important, obviously, and there is that temptation when you're doing a doctorate to read everything, but it is so important. And that's why I think the research question is so important, because it will guide you in what you read, but try, as much as possible to master the literature, because, your literature review is going to be so fundamental to your doctorate and to your research. It's going to be so important to your research question and to everything else because what your literature review will do is it will help you to find a gap in the literature that you will then try to address. And so it's really important that you're aware of that you're aware of what others have done in the field, and that there's a gap in the field, because ultimately what a PhD is about is making a contribution to knowledge, or if you're doing a professional doctorate, it's making a contribution to professional practice. So to do that, you must be aware of the literature. You must be aware of what's gone on before. So you're making something, so you're creating something new, which again, is immensely exciting, but hugely frustrating, as any kind of act of creativity is. But that's why it's just so important for you to master the literature, because you have to be aware of what's been written. Because if you come along and say, okay, I'm addressing this gap, or I'm going to try and address this gap in the literature, then, when it comes to you submit a chapter to your supervisor, and your supervisor could say, no, this has been done by this particular author already. So, or it could come to the stage, say, of when you're submitting something for your Viva itself, and the external examiner could say, this has been done. This type of study has already been done. So that's why it's just so important that you're aware of the literature. And again, that's why, your research question is so, so important, because that will determine what you read, and what you read will then determine, the kind of gap that you identify in the knowledge. Okay. Again, really important to keep up to date. So many fields of study are developing so quickly. So it's really important to keep up with new approaches, with new statistical methods, with evolving areas in your field. When I can say, even from the time I was doing a PhD to today, even ways of, of doing the research have been transformed. They've been transformed by technology in terms of, say, with regard to internet and ebooks and electronic resources. And now it's further becoming, transformed by the advent of generative artificial intelligence. So it's so important for you to keep up with what new approaches, what statistical methods, and how your field is evolving. Because you could find that by the time you start your PhD and by the time it gets to the end, your field has evolved in a way that's almost unrecognizable to you from when you first started. So it's really important, if your field is a very dynamic one and susceptible to a lot of very rapid change, that's why, it's so important for you to keep up with new approaches, new methods, new ways of analyzing the literature and the data, new ways of analyzing the data, should we say. Okay, it's always good here to develop a plan, particularly, if you're thinking about an academic career, but also if your doctorate or PhD is, say, one that is based on writing a certain number of articles. So that's why it's always good to develop a plan for multiple publications. So here I would say consult with your supervisor and with others in your field, like faculty members and your peers and your fellow doctoral candidates, and discuss. What's also good is when you get to the end of your doctorate, and you'll have an opportunity then to discuss, the possibility for publication, with your external examiners, with your supervisor, and with others. And again, while you're doing a PhD and while you're attending conferences and networking, you will encounter people with whom you will wish to collaborate. That's almost inevitable, from other institutions and other jurisdictions. And again, that's all an exciting part of doing a PhD. Okay, I'll just say here with 15, just find your own voice as a scholar. So by this, what I mean by this is, I have seen external examiner reports where they say, this is a brilliant thesis, this is a great piece of work. It's a great piece of literature, what has been submitted, what has been written. But the scholar, the candidate, I can't hear their own voice in the work. So, and if you delve deeper into that, what that usually means is that the external examiner or internal examiner might say, it's just that I can't hear, what they are saying. I can hear the voice of so many other scholars. I can see that they have mastered the literature. I can see that they have an excellent research question. I can see they've done so much well in terms of their research approach and design, in terms of their, in terms of their use of sampling and their data collection and data analysis techniques, and all the ethical considerations and the justification and the limits that they put on, the methodological choices that they've made, and the rationale behind them are all very clear. However, what doesn't come across is the scholar's own voice. They are too reliant on the literature. They are too in awe of the literature that has been written already. They are too in awe of the scholars that have gone before them. They have not broken free of the great scholarship in the field to develop their own voice and their own confidence. And sometimes it's just a matter of confidence. But it's really important that you do this, because this shows that you have evolved and developed and mastered the literature, but also that you are now a really confident researcher. And again, when I use the word confident, I mean, that you are someone who can express your the choices that you've made with regard to, how you've approached the research, how you've designed it, how you've come up with your research question, how you've gone about your data collection and analysis, all of those things, and how you analyze your findings. And again, I'll talk about this, in the coming weeks with regard to the literature review, and how, and in terms of your analysis of your own findings. But it's so important that you distinguish yourself from others who have gone before you in the field. You wouldn't believe how important that is. But that's because as a PhD researcher, you're engaging in new knowledge, you're creating new knowledge, you're making an original contribution. You are going to be the expert in the field by the time you've finished. But it's amazing how many people, how that sometimes does not come across in the final thesis itself, that that you are the expert, you are the person with the most knowledge of anybody in this particular topic. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, try to attend important conferences and network at them as well. And try, I would say, if it's your first year, to try to attend a research conference in your first year, and try to attend especially kind of subject specific conferences or speciality conferences. If you're going to, if you're picking one conference, don't go to like the conference of interdisciplinary studies, because that could be like a predatory or not a credible conference. But go to one, discuss this with your supervisor or your supervisory team. Go to conferences that that are specific to your particular topic, because you get a lot more out of that than going to more general conference. Okay. Also, use every opportunity you can to seek funding, because funding, again, for so many people, it's a game changer when it comes to doing your research. And the more funding you have, the less you're dependent on doing extra work outside of your doctorate as well. It's such a huge issue for almost anybody doing a doctorate is funding. And if you get to the stage where you do apply for funding, but you don't get it, just make sure that you look for reasons and get feedback on why you didn't get the funding, and that will help you with your next application. And what I mean by your next application is that once you have written one application for funding, and say if you don't get that funding, but even if you do get it, sending in another funding application becomes much easier because you have the basis of it written already. So that's why I said there, a resubmission is the easiest funding application you will ever write, because what that can be is you can take your original funding application and then rehone it, take on board the feedback that you get, and then rewrite it in a particular way and make a resubmission. Okay, the next one, again, sometimes this is sometimes neglected because, I think it was the historian Roy Foster who referred to the how someone's beautiful style and their writing skill was eradicated by what he called the PhD industry. And because we have, we now have, as I said, almost a template for how a PhD is to be written, sometimes we forget that the great skill that is involved in the great rhetorical skill that research is. What I mean about that is that, you're writing, when you're writing a thesis, it should flow. It should be a good narrative. Somebody once said to me that the advice they would give to their PhD candidates is be kind to your examiners. and write a thesis that, that really is coherent, it's well written, it's focused, because it's something that we neglect sometimes, just the importance of actually writing something in a coherent way, in a way that is, convincing, but in a way that really makes people want to get to the next page. And I remember somebody saying about a PhD a PhD about trade policy. They said, I love the thesis because I kept wanting to get to the next page because it read like a great crime novel. Now, it doesn't mean, it was written as a crime, in the style of a crime novel, but it was just, you do need to have a good narrative and a good flow. And again, if you're writing, say, if you have different papers and you're trying to put them into a coherent unit, that's where the convincing narrative can be, really, really important. I would just say that writing a doctorate, it's a social process. And that's why I would say that you should try also to communicate your research to a non-specialist or non-expert audience. And we have a number of ways of doing that here in the Doctoral College. We put on, during Research Week, the 3-minute thesis, and picture this about having a pictorial representation of your research, or bake your PhD competition. So there are all ways in which you can, communicate your research to a non-specialist or non-expert audience. Or indeed, if you want, we have a podcast series called PhD Pulse for doctoral candidates to disseminate and to talk about their research, and that's put up on Spotify. So, but it's just important that you learn to communicate your research, because, ultimately, you're looking at what one of the things that's really important about your research is the impact it's going to have. What benefit is it going to have for society as a whole? And if you're using terms from your own particular specific area or field or discipline, a lot of the time this won't translate. It may not translate to people in your own faculty. So you can imagine it's really important that you learn how to communicate what your research is about in a way that's understandable to the general public. So it's also good, to identify the skills that you would like to have for your future employment and how you can enhance them. And I'll talk a lot more about this when we do the webinar, say the IUA PhD graduate skills statement, but also throughout the academic year, we're going to be talking a lot about that also in various forums. Experiential learning, again, this is a process whereby, knowledge is created, if you like, through on-the-job training, if you like, and so useful to your doctorate itself. But it helps you understand, that conducting research is highly challenging, that it's really invigorating and exciting, and it's never perfect. It's never going to be, absolutely perfect. But that's why experiential learning, is so useful as well. And that's why, if you have a chance to test your research in a working situation, that is, a really good way of showing about the credibility of your research, and that you've understood things that will contribute to the trustworthiness and credibility of your research. Again, I would say just 23 would be disseminate your research as widely as possible. Again, we're going to talk about this in the coming weeks, just about, how you can try to get your research out to as many as many areas as possible, not just to the general public, but within your own field, within your own discipline as well. Also, it's so important that you get help. If you're struggling, everyone is going to struggle at some stage of the doctorate. That is inevitable. So it's so important, that you get help, because what you're undertaking is a huge project. A lot of people find it overwhelming, can be, very intimidating. Everybody struggles to one degree or another. So make sure that you get some kind of help, at whatever stage it might be of your doctorate. And also, The last thing I'll say, apart from, enjoy what you're doing, obviously, is to know when to stop. Now, there was a director who once said, um, I never finish a movie. He said, they always take it from me. And in a way, a doctorate is a bit like that. You'll probably never feel that your doctorate is 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 completely written and that you're satisfied with it. The vast majority of PhD candidates tend to be perfectionists, and when you're a perfectionist, nothing is ever good enough. So it's really important that you know when to stop. And again, you um uh, it's amazing how many people just always want to go back and uh, reread and to refine and hone their PhD again and again and again. So it's something that you may not, take into account now, but one that will be important to remember into the future is just knowing when to stop, when you are done. Okay. So, and then I would just say for you, we might just have a short discussion about this. It's about, what for you are the key elements of becoming a successful doctorate researcher. And thank you so much for your attention. So what we'll do is we'll just have a short discussion. I'll just say goodbye for now to people watching online and see you very shortly again for another University of Limerick Doctoral College webinar. So thank you all very much and see you shortly. Bye-bye. Okay, so thank you all. And so